Hello class, welcome to lesson 2 of our course in which we will be discussing colonial America. I hope you don't mind, but I am outside today because it's a beautiful day, beautiful autumn day. Let me give you a sense of what's going on here. You can see the different colors, the various golds and greens and reds, and the children's toys, of course, on the patio. Don't mind those. But yeah, I hope you don't mind the informality, but we are going to be covering a period of several hundred years, so I think some informality is okay. Um, but in this lesson, we're going to be talking about religion, Columbus, disease, and some of the early ideas that fueled what would become part of the American identity. We'll also talk about what family looked like, family life looked like in these early settlements, and the role that women played. And finally, of course, we'll talk about the relationship that existed between European settlers and Native Americans, which you can guess usually didn't go so well. So to start off, let's talk about what religion looked like. Now, European religion shaped almost everything that Europeans did, except for maybe money. But even religion even influenced the way they thought about economics. So nearly every European nation had a state religion, which had been the cause of many wars and rivalries that carried over into the colonial period. But at the very core of European Christianity was the idea of freedom. Men, especially men, should believed that they should have the right to govern themselves. This did not mean that there was religious toleration, but it did mean that if you lived what they believed to be the correct religion, then you were in charge of your own fortunes and decisions and future. So Europeans began exploring essentially because their religion told them to. They had to spread this freedom to those who didn't have it, specifically Native Americans and Africans. And so by spreading this gospel, they could also spread their wealth. And if they became wealthy in the process, well, then that just meant that God was in their favor. The Portuguese are credited usually as being the first successful European explorers after they sailed around the southern tip of Africa at the Cape of Good Hope. Um, they India had been the source of intrigue in Europe for a long time, but land routes across Asia were very, very difficult. Italian merchants controlled many of the roads, which made the journey very expensive and somewhat dangerous. So, if a country could find a way to make the sea voyage successful, then that would save them a lot of money. And Portugal was very effective in doing that. I should also mention that the Crusades played something of a part in this. The Crusades started in the late 11th century and had been fought off and on up until this point. And the European nations believed that if they could get a foothold to gain access into the Holy Land, that would make them very, very powerful, especially if they could be the first country to do it. So that also factored in, but India was the main focus, and Portugal made a fortune sailing around Africa, building up these trade outposts where they could control sort of the sea traffic that went around Africa, and they also made fortunes with these African nations trading materials, textiles, slaves, and gold. So Portugal was very successful, and Spain and France won in. They won a piece of the action. England did too, but they weren't quite as developed at this point, which made it difficult for them to catch up. So Spain wants in, and Columbus falls into this situation. So Columbus is very, very interesting. He's a very interesting character with a very interesting story. There's a lot of fiction mixed in with fact regarding him. But essentially, we know that Columbus was a good sailor with a talent for making maps. And we also think that he believed that the Earth was smaller than it was. There's evidence that his contemporaries knew that the Earth was huge and that a western voyage to Asia would be very unsuccessful, which may be why Columbus had such a hard time attaining funding for his trip. But in any case, Spain decides to fund him, and although he may not have been the first European to arrive in the Western Hemisphere, he was certainly the first to document these new lands. And he did think that he had reached some islands in the Far East, but decades later it became apparent that he had found a whole new continent. Now, just imagine that for a second, the immensity of that discovery. You know, imagine you're just like a merchant or a farmer living your life, trying not to get the plague, when all of a sudden somebody tells you, hey, some guy discovered a new continent on the other side of the world. I mean, that's enormous. And the only modern equivalent that I can think of to that would be like finding intelligent life on another planet. So it was a big deal. They knew it was a big deal, but they probably didn't know how big of a deal it was yet. So Spain starts to build their empire. They start in the Caribbean and South America, and eventually they spread into the North American Southwest, making them the first official Europeans to build settlements in what would become America, or the United States. Now, they didn't build settlements per se, but they did build missions, which were established to help spread the gospel to Native Americans, which they did, but they also turned Native Americans into slaves and made them work their farms. But we'll talk more about that in the next lesson. The French were also successful. They didn't really build settlements either. They came to explore, trade, and make a ton of money, which they did. But because they weren't building permanent settlements per se, they were able to establish very good relations with Native Americans. And they came to understand the Native American economy, which was very heavy on gift giving. Excuse me. And because they understood this, they were able to build very good alliances with Native American tribes, especially in the areas that are now Michigan and Wisconsin. And they became very successful. And then finally, over 100 years after Spain had begun colonizing South America, and decades after the French had started making their fortune, England is finally in a position where they can start to build settlements. Their first attempts fail, but after a little while, they're able to build one called Jamestown, which is able to take hold through a lot of discipline and somewhat friendly relations with local Indians. Jamestown survives its first few winters, but it wasn't until they started growing and selling tobacco that things really get going. Within a few decades, Jamestown became one of the most profitable colonies in the New World. But they also struggled because they couldn't get any women to move there. So they had a hard time building up a sustainable population. Now, why a young single woman wouldn't want to uproot herself and move to the uncivilized wilderness where only poor men who couldn't afford to live in England, that's just a mystery to me. I don't know why they didn't see the appeal, but anyway. Some women did move there, and so the population did grow, and eventually it was able to become self-sustaining. On the other hand, the Puritan colonies in New England were populated with families. Now, we all know the story of the Pilgrims, but some people have a hard time distinguishing between Pilgrims and Puritans. So now, here's a little bit of trivia that you can use at this upcoming Thanksgiving to make things a little less awkward with your racist uncle or your snowflake nephew, whichever. But essentially, Puritans were members of the Church of England, the Anglican Church, and they felt like the church was becoming too corrupt and resembled Catholicism too much. They didn't want to leave the church. Instead, they wanted to cleanse it from within. They felt that you can't save the institution if you're outside of the institution. So many of them thought that if they could start a new society from scratch, then they could show the rest of the church and the world how to live the gospel appropriately. So the New World was ideal for this. Now the Pilgrims were part of this Puritan group, but they were more extreme. They were okay leaving the Anglican Church. They wanted to set up their own parishes, which meant that they didn't want to leave the church exactly, but they did want to set up their own sort of institutions, which of course the leaders of the Anglican Church did not approve of. So the Pilgrims did experience some religious, what's the word, intolerance and prejudice. So they decided to move to Plymouth and set up their own colony there in 1620. They were very, very poor and had a very hard time. There were only 120 of them that made the voyage, and less than half of them survived the first few months. So it was very rough going. On the other hand, the Puritans came to what became the Massachusetts Bay Colony by the thousands. They were more middle class, and they were intent on staying in the church, but still wanted to cleanse it. And so this idea that early American settlers came to the New World in search of religious freedom is only partly true. First of all, that's not the story with Jamestown. It's not really the story with the Puritans in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And it's halfway true with the Pilgrims in Plymouth. Because as I said, the Pilgrims were very, very poor. And so in order to be able to make the journey, they had to get funding, which meant that they had investors, which meant that the investors expected some kind of financial return. So the Puritans in Massachusetts Bay Colony were largely self-sufficient. They were more wealthy, but they were kind of in the same position. They came to set up the ideal colony, but they also wanted to make some money. One of their leaders, John Winthrop, was as much of an investor as he was a religious leader. And so they came to, New England settlers came to the New World to set up the ideal Christian society, but if they made a lot of money in the process, then, all the better. So that's essentially our lesson for this week. I hope you enjoy it. It is a little bit more intense than last week's, but there's some good stuff in there. And as always, if you have any questions, please let me know. Good luck.